Well, it's not very often that Sunday morning begins with the abomination of desolation in the scripture reading. And that's because we've been working our way through the Gospel of Mark now for 14 months. And we stopped last week in verse 13, and we're picking up in verse 14 and following today. And as we begin this morning, I want to highlight two things as we're going into the text. Number one, connecting us to last week, is that everything in verses 5 through 37 flows from the disciples' question in verse 4 about the temple's destruction. That's where this whole conversation comes from. And notice, unlike other places in the gospel where the disciples are challenging Jesus and pushing back on what he has to say, they're not pushing back. No, they're not challenging Jesus. They're actually blown away at his revelation that the temple is going to be destroyed, and they simply want to know, when is it going to happen and what sign is it going to be? They want to be ready. They want to be ready. Yet, as we saw last week, what was Jesus' initial response to their question? His initial response was to warn them of all of the unsettling events that happen in life that are not connected to the temple's destruction. They're part and parcel of discipleship. Every disciple's discipleship involves things like false teachers and natural disasters and widespread war. And there's times of intense persecution that gospel believers must go through that are not connected in any way to immediate signs of God's return. And what we saw in that is that Jesus is more concerned that his disciples are ready to stand side by side for the sake of the gospel than he is about them being informed about the specific timing of coming events. That's what we saw. So number two, as we move into our text this week, Jesus doesn't ignore their request. He's not ignoring their question, because last week, if we had just stopped there, it's like, Jesus, you never really got to what they asked. That's this week. He doesn't simply disclose the singular event that will signal the temple's destruction, though, this week. Jesus provides his disciples with the ultimate reason to stand fast and to persevere in the face of persecution and in the face of history's greatest horrors. He gives them the reason that they can stand in the face of anything that happens in life. It's the promise that he will usher his people into everlasting glory when he returns. It's a promise that Jesus wins. No matter what's going on, Jesus wins. And to put it in terms of our main idea today, it's this, is that perseverance is fueled by a steadfast hope in the second coming, not fervent sign watching. So let's go to verses 14 through 23 and see what Jesus has to tell his disciples. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let the one who is on the housetop not go down nor enter his house or take anything out, and let not the one who's in the field not turn back and take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that it might not happen in the winter. For in those days there will be such tribulation as not has been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short those days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or look, there he is, don't believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard, I've told you these things beforehand. So how are we going to walk through this section? There is so much in here. I've organized it around 3 questions that probably won't answer every question you have about the text, but they will answer many questions. Three questions are this. What in the world is the abomination of desolation? Number two, what are they supposed to do when they see the abomination of desolation? And number three, I think even more importantly, our question is how are we supposed to interpret these events? So those are the three questions that we're going to process this first section under. So when it comes to the abomination of desolation, if we just go to a Greek or a Hebrew lexicon and we look up the nouns, because that's what they are, we find out that the noun abomination denotes something that's loathsome or detestable or repugnant to God, and it's often used in the context of pagan worship. And the noun desolation means something that's devastated or rendered uninhabitable. So if we just look at the words themselves and we put them together, they appear to indicate something that's holy that has been rendered unholy and unusable to God because it was defiled through an act of unsanctioned or idolatrous worship. If we just kind of take the two words and we put them together. But we don't have to just stop there at the lexicons because Jesus didn't just invent this term out of the blue. It didn't just roll off his tongue as something that just popped into his mind in the moment. He's actually depicting this future event through a pre-established pattern that was in Daniel chapter 11. There's patterns that we see in our Bible of events that happen and similar events happen later on. It's called typology. So let's go to Daniel chapter 11, starting in verse 31, and see where Jesus is pulling this imagery from. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and the fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. Sound familiar? The abomination of desolation, Daniel chapter 11. Reading on, he shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. Jumping to verse 36, and the king will do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and he shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till indignation is accomplished, for what he has decreed shall be done. Now there's a lot going on in there, but this event is something that actually happened. Daniel's prophesying about an event that happens in 167 BC. When the Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes IV not only outlawed the entire sacrificial system and the rite of circumcision under the threat that whoever does it, if anyone offers sacrifices, if anybody sacrifices their or circumcises their child, they're going to be put to death. Not only did Antiochus Epiphanes do that, he also lashed out against God himself by building a pagan altar over the altar in the temple, and he sacrificed pigs on it. That's what Antiochus Epiphanes did in 167 BC. So Daniel prophesied about something that was ahead. Jesus is looking in the rearview mirror at that event and saying, there's an event that's similar, and it's going to be happening in the future. He's saying that some ostentatious, desecrating event similar to the event that Daniel prophesied that we saw happen with Antiochus Epiphanes is going to happen. But he doesn't tell them exactly what it is. And if you want to spend a good couple hours reading, you could read the various ideas of what exact event it is. It's one place where there's a lot of disagreement of people putting their finger exactly on the spot. But it's clear. Jesus says it's going to happen. When it happens, he actually says, you need to respond in a certain way when it happens. And this is important because last week, when Jesus laid out all of the things that the disciples might endure in their lifetime, right? False teachers, natural calamities, persecution, war. In not a single one of those warnings did Jesus tell them to run. In every one of those, he warned them so that they would stay and they would persevere, even in persecution, standing in front of governors and kings for the gospel of Jesus Christ. But when it comes to this event, Jesus tells them, run. Run. Don't go into your house, grab anything. Don't pack your belongings. If you're out in the field, don't run back to your house to grab your heavy winter jacket. Don't do any of that. It's going to be hard for women who are pregnant or nursing during those days because when it happens, it's going to be horrible. And pray it doesn't happen in winter because this sign is going to be a signal that this moment of undeniable urgency has landed. And you'd better respond when it does. And this is important. It's easy for us to overlook. Why is this exhortation so clear? Because in our modern day and age, 2,000 years down the road, we have catastrophe warnings all the time. Things happen. What are we supposed to do? Jump in our cars, go somewhere safe. When I lived in Alaska on Kodiak Island, we had tsunami sirens. Tsunami sirens go off. You have to evacuate up to at least 100 feet in elevation to be safe. Well, in ancient times, you didn't run for the hills for safety. You ran into the city for safety. Cities have big walls. Jerusalem had big walls, right? What's inside that city? There's army inside the city. There's food inside the city. There's water inside the city. It's a place of safety. All the people that live on the outside of Jerusalem would normally collapse and come into the city in time of invasion, where Jesus is saying, don't go into the city. Run into the hills. You are not going to want to be in the city when this time comes. It's counterintuitive. It seems totally backwards to a person from the first century to run for the hills. In addition to this, Jesus warns them, when this is happening, you're probably going to hear people saying, you think, oh, Jesus is here and it's safe. Don't worry about it. People who are going to say, it's fine, go into the city. But he says that they're unwarranted oracles, and they are not going to bring protection, and they're not going to bring deliverance. In fact, the Jewish historian Josephus tells us that false prophets doomed countless thousands of people to their death on the baseless promises of divine protection if they went into Jerusalem. When the army's coming in, they were running the wrong way. If you ever read the prophet Jeremiah, it's very similar to Jeremiah's prophecy. Jeremiah's prophesying the Babylonian armies coming in, and his prophecy is what? Leave the city. If you want to live, leave the city. And Jesus is telling them the same thing, because when that time comes, Jerusalem is going to be ground zero for the judgment of God. Jesus has cursed the temple already. He's cursed the priesthood. He's declared it null and void. And the final act is going to fall roughly 40 years after the crucifixion of Jesus Christ in 70 AD. Second thing that we see in this passage is that this period is going to be marked by a period of unimaginable suffering and tribulation. Back to Josephus, the Jewish historian, who cataloged the unbridled horrors of this event. On the outside, when they finally took the city, they crucified so many Jews that they ran out of wood. Just let that sink in. They ran out of wood, not people. On the inside of the city, during the siege, Josephus tells us that there was just horrible infighting among the Jews, that there was murder and famine and disease and even cannibalism going on. It's horrible. And when Titus's troops finally broke through the wall and they took the city, Josephus tells us that there's likely 1 million people that died, and they hauled off 97,000 as captives. That's what happened at the fall of Jerusalem. Yet as we look at this text and the way that Jesus describes the event in verses 14 all the way to verse 23, we're still left with some questions. The questions of how are we supposed to interpret these events? How are we supposed to really interpret them? And what I mean by this is some of the things that Jesus says are hard to align with 70 AD. Though he's clearly answering a question about the temple that falls in 70 AD. I mean, the first thing, I mean, how can Jesus say that the events in 70 AD are going to be the worst thing that has happened since the beginning of creation until now and will never be in the history of mankind? Jesus says that in verse 19. How can Jesus say that the appalling, brutal death of 1 million people, just that number blows me away. But how can he say it's the worst thing that happened in history, given that 6 million Jews were systematically exterminated by Nazis during World War II? The 25 million people who died in the Black Plague, the 20 million people who died in World War I, the 75 million people who died in World War II. I mean, that's just some stuff that happened in our recent history, and it eclipses 70 AD. And Jesus says it's the worst. Well, when it comes to this question, biblical scholars fall into 3 general camps. 3 general camps. One that would say that what Jesus says in verse 19 about this being the worst event that ever has been or ever will be, that Jesus is simply using hyperbole. He's using exaggeration to make his point. He's not trying to gauge the atrocities of 70 AD on the historical scale of human bloodshed. Okay? That's what one group would say. Everything here is about the temple. He's not trying to gauge it on the scale of human history. He's trying to emphasize it's going to be tragic. Second group of individuals would propose that verses 14 through 23 are a leap into the future. And this isn't out of the question. We can go into the Old Testament and we can read biblical prophecies, and from one verse to the next, we see looking backwards, but there was a leap. And it wasn't evident in the text to the original readers. And that's what they would say, is that Jesus is taking a prophetic leap from the first century to the distant future to the Great Tribulation, and therefore everything between this really has to do with more like 2 Thessalonians and Revelation chapter 13, dealing with the Great Tribulation. Then there's the third. The third group of scholars contend that this entire chapter, and especially these verses, are a mix of both historical and end times imagery. Or if we want to use the nerd word, eschatological. Historical and eschatological imagery, both of them being brought together. So he's talking about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and he's talking about the Great Tribulation at the end. To explain it, let me explain it this way. So imagine you go to a movie theater. I think most of all of us been to a movie theater, except this movie theater doesn't just have one projector, it has 2 projectors. And those projectors are showing 2 different films that are similar. They have similar events, but they are historically different events. They're both showing on the screen. You're not sure when one cuts out and the other one shows, or when they're showing at the same time. And there's going to be some events you look at it and go, that's clearly this event. And that's clearly the other event. But there's going to be times where it is unclear which is which. And that's how they would describe this text. And frankly, that's where I personally fall on this text, is it's a mix of temple and end times smashed together because of how these events relate, which we're going to unpack next. And as I explained last week, if you weren't here, this is one of those areas where if we have a disagreement over issues of timing and some interpretation, these are not issues of gospel. So let me explain the reasons why I think this is a mix. I think it's a mix, number one, because as we have emphasized all the way through last week and this week, this entire discussion flows from one question. Hey, Jesus, you just said the temple's going to get destroyed. Tell me more about that. And it doesn't make any sense for Jesus to tell them about all the things that are not a sign of the temple's destruction to then skip over past the temple's destruction and jump all the way to the Great Tribulation at the end. They've asked a question. Number two, when we examine what Jesus says about the temple's destruction in light of what Paul says about the second coming of Christ in 2 Thessalonians, it's increasingly clear that Jesus and Paul are actually kind of following the same script. Or if we want to say, they're following the same pattern. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. So Paul, just make sure, Paul is clearly here writing about the end, okay? Now concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered together him, we ask you, brothers, not to be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed either by a spirit or a spoken word or a letter seeming to be from us to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. What's the problem? Somebody's convinced them the day of the Lord has come. And he's saying, no, it's not come. Okay? So we're not talking about temple, we're talking about the day of the Lord, and that's always at the end. Let no one deceive you in any way. For the day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. See, Paul's explanation in verses 3 and 4 sound very much like Mark chapter 13, and it certainly sounds like Daniel chapter 11. You notice the similarities of what we saw in Daniel, the inferences in Mark, and what Paul describes in 2 Thessalonians. But Paul here is not talking about, again, the temple. He's talking about the future. So that'd be number two. Number three, reason why I would see this passage being a blending of both events is that Jesus' statement in verse 19 about the tribulation being the worst event that has happened in the history of mankind is actually an allusion that is pulled out of Daniel chapter 12. In fact, this entire section, Jesus has Daniel on his mind. We're going to see even a bit more. But Daniel chapter 12, let's look here what he says. Daniel says this, at that time, and here Daniel is talking about like the last day. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge over your people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never been since there was a nation till that time. Okay, you hear that? Very, very similar to what Jesus is saying in Mark. But at that time your people shall be delivered, every one whose name shall be written in the book of life. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and to everlasting contempt. Notice verse 2 really tips our hand to let us think. You start talking about resurrection, well, we can be pretty confident we're not talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, right? We're talking about resurrection. But what are the end of days going to be like according to Daniel, who's looking all the way to the end? He says it's going to be a time of trouble such as never been since there was a nation until that time. Which is why I don't think Jesus is merely using hyperbole in Mark chapter 13. And according to Daniel, what follows this time of unmatched tribulation? It's nothing less. It's nothing less than the resurrection of the dead and final judgment in which everyone who belongs to God will be raised to eternal life. Which leads me to the fourth and final reason why I believe this section here is a mixing of 70 AD in the future. Is it Jesus follows the script of Daniel chapter 12 as he goes forward. He goes to the return of Christ. Mark chapter 13, starting in verse 24. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and great glory. And then he will send out his angels, and he will gather his elect from the four winds, from the four ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. So what I want you to see is that Jesus is going from this question about the temple and in the kind of events that surround the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD is but a coming, if you want to say it, it's like a movie trailer for the event that's really coming. It's like the end. Here's just a little bit of what the end is going to look like in the fall of Jerusalem. But the events are very similar. But as we finish off this section in Mark, Jesus instantly goes where Daniel goes with that same quotation about it being the worst, and he says, this is when Jesus returns. Jesus, especially in verses 24 through 27, is clearly transitioning to a period that is far beyond 70 AD. He's looking all the way forward to that time which ends in the blessed hope, as Paul puts it. Period which there is a time of great tribulation. We're warned about it. Numerous places in God's word. And it's a period of time in which, according to Jesus, the universe itself is going to announce Jesus' imminent return. Not in hidden signs that only a select few can decipher. Get out their secret decoder ring. It's going to be an unmistakable unmaking of the universe when Jesus arrives. No one will be able to say, oh, I didn't get it. I didn't realize that was Jesus came. When Jesus comes, he's telling us here in the passage, it is going to be so unmistakable, nobody can miss it. In fact, as one commentator puts it, the fundamental idea here in this passage is that the elements of creation are actually thrown into confusion and fear because Jesus appears. It's not a sign that he's about to appear, like we're waiting for this astronomical event, then that astronomical event, then another astronomical event. It's like this stuff is happening all at the same time because Jesus is returning in glory. Listen to Psalm 97, verses 1 through 4. The Lord reigns. Let the earth rejoice. Let the many coastlands be glad. Clouds and thick darkness are all around him. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. Fire goes out before him and burns up his adversaries all around. His lightnings light up the world. The earth sees and trembles. The mountains melt like wax before the Lord of all the earth. This is what happens when the creator of the universe appears in glory. And no one will miss it. See, what do we see in this text is Jesus' second coming is nothing like his first coming. When Jesus comes, the first time, what does he come as? He comes as the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. A man who is discarded, despised, and rejected. That's how Jesus came. But when Jesus returns, he's going to actually fulfill another passage in Daniel. Daniel chapter 7. When Jesus returns as the promised Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7. Starting in verse 13. This is the scene that Jesus describes when he says in verse 26, and then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and great glory. Listen to Daniel 7. And I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a Son of Man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and he was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples and nations and languages should serve him, and his dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Daniel's all over this section. I mean, Jesus is just tipping his hand to his disciples and saying, I've been trying to tell you who I am and why I came for this whole period of my ministry, but now he says, I'm him. I am him. I'm the Son of Man. How many times have you read through your Gospels and you see Jesus call himself the Son of Man? And maybe you've heard somebody say, well, that just means he's identifying with humanity. Son of Man. He had a human mom. No, it's a veiled reference. Jesus can use it because it's not quite clear to his audience, but here in this text, he makes it clear that every time he calls himself the Son of Man, how should we understand it? We should understand it in light of Daniel chapter 7. In fact, Jesus comes back to it when he's questioned at his trial. Same quotation. Jesus is showing who he truly is. And he says, when I return, I'm going to gather my people from every corner of the planet. Doesn't matter what you're facing. Doesn't matter what's happening. I will vindicate my people. Just as Daniel pointed out in Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. Reminding us that there's resurrection. Paul brings this together later on in 1 Corinthians, reminding us that it's not just something that happens for dead or for the living, but when Jesus returns, the dead are raised and the living are brought up to be with Jesus. There is nobody who is left out of the promise. And Jesus is going to reign as king. I mean, just think about it. Jesus is the one who has dominion and a kingdom that will not pass away. Jesus is the one who will rule over all peoples and all nations and all languages. Jesus is the one who is reigning right now at the Father's right hand while the Father is putting all of his enemies underneath his feet. Jesus is the one who's coming on the clouds to gather his elect, and Jesus is the one who will also judge the quick and the dead. Which means that Jesus is the only one who is worthy of our undying devotion. This is why we can have hope. Why can we persevere? What hope do we have no matter what's happening in life? That we have not been abandoned, that this is not just all some nice way to live our life and then die and then it's all over. No, Jesus is coming. There is reward. There is an end. No matter where you find yourself in God's timeline. So as we close, I want to close with an observation and an exhortation. First, I want you to see what Jesus is doing in these verses. Is that he's providing his disciples and the disciples of every age with the singular hope that can fuel their persevering, gospel-centered faithfulness in the midst of false teaching, in the midst of natural disasters, in the midst of widespread war, in the midst of horrible persecution, in the midst even of the kind of tribulation which nobody has ever seen the likes thereof. It's the promise of his glorious return. In all the questions that we can get tied up in verses 14 through 23, that's not the main focus of the passage. Jesus wants us to make sure that we get to verses 24 through 27. See, Jesus' disciples ultimately don't need to know everything about the coming destruction of Jerusalem. I think that's one of the things that we need to pull out of this text. I'm going to tell you some stuff, but you don't need to know everything. And Christians, we don't need to know everything about the Great Tribulation and all the events and timing that surround it as well. We don't need to know everything. We have the things that God has revealed and given to us. But we don't need to spend our time at Prophecy Watch conferences or playing with gematria or tracking cosmological phenomena or stockpiling guns, ammo, and MRE for Armageddon. Just like the disciples, we need to know that Jesus wins. Not only does Jesus win, he's already won. We're waiting for the end. Jesus has won. And we're on the winning side no matter how hard our life might be. There are periods of history where Christians have had it easy. There's periods of history where Christians have had it incredibly hard, and everywhere in between. But they're all called to persevering faithfulness with the same promises and with the same hope. In fact, if there's ever a time in our life when we feel like we're just breaking, you just feel like you're at the breaking point, the thing that you need the most at that point in time in your life when you feel like you are just ready to hang up this thing being a Christian, it's not going to be a detailed prophetic calendar. It's going to be the promise that Jesus will right every wrong when he returns. We're never going to right every wrong that happens against us in this life, but Jesus will. Number 2, I have an exhortation. The exhortation is going to seem a little counterintuitive. And that's, don't let prophecy sign watchers poison your personal pursuit and study of the last things. I know that in last week and this week, I've highlighted there's some that put an unhealthy amount of time into all of this, but just because some people approach it in a way that probably is not the best doesn't mean that we should therefore ignore it all. Abuse and misuse of prophecy by fellow Christians should never drive us to abandon biblical prophecy, but to understand it rightly. And as we study it, there's a key word involved, is humility. We study in humility. We don't study expecting that if we just study hard enough, we're going to be able to fill in all the gaps and put all the pieces together. We study it with humility, knowing that just as we look back at Jesus' first coming, when God did not give all of the events and lay out how everything would fit together, he gave markers. In the same way, we look to the future. God has given us some markers. In fact, you know what? If anything doesn't drive you to humility, as we think about biblical prophecy, it should be this. When John the Baptist is in prison, and Jesus is out performing his ministry and doing miracles, John the Baptist sends his disciples to Jesus. John is a prophet. And he goes, hey, are you the one we're waiting for, or is it somebody else? John the Baptist doesn't know. That should be good for us to hear. He didn't know. And it was right in front of him. See, God wants us to live by faith and hope in his imminent and glorious return. When it comes down to it, eschatology is something that should encourage us towards faithful obedience. Faithful obedience, faithful perseverance, hope and trust. As we close, I want to close with 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 7 through 11. Because Peter was one of the four on the Mount of Olives asking Jesus about the end. And Peter is writing to a group of churches, and he says this: the end of all things is at hand. Now just let that sink in. The end of all things is at hand, and he wrote this 2,000 years ago. He's not wrong. We are in a large period called the end times. There's still the last day to come. The end of all things is at hand. But what does he want them to do as a result of it being the end days? Therefore, be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. Full stop. Don't lose your mind in worry and anxiety and fear over everything that's coming. No, be focused, be trusting, be reliant on God. Stay steadfast in your prayer. Verse 8, above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. The end is near. What do I want you to do, church? Love each other. Don't go dig your bunker and roll out your barbed wire and refuse to have anybody over to your house because the end is probably coming. And no, love one another. And in fact, all those foibles and all of those frustrating things and your pet peeves you have with other people and the small kinds of sins that arise up that make you want to be just frustrated with them, love covers a multitude of sins. But not only love one another, verse 9, show hospitality to one another without grumbling. Remember, hospitality is a word we've learned already. It's not a word when we think about having our best friends over for dinner on Sunday. It's a word that means loving strangers. Love the people that you don't know very well in your church. Have them over. Love your neighbors, your unbelieving neighbors. Have them into your home. Show them the love of Jesus Christ. Living in light of the end. That's what living in light of the end looks like. It's the end and it's at hand. Have people into your home for dinner. Verse 10, as each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks as one who speaks the oracles of God. Whoever serves as one who serves by the strength that God supplies. Christian, how do you live in light of the end? Use the gifts that God has given you for his glory and the upbuilding of the church. This isn't a call to run to the mountains. This isn't a call to flee. It's a call to serve with the gifts that God has given you, whether they be preaching and teaching gifts, whether they be serving gifts. Notice, one is not higher than the other. Do it. The end is coming. Do it. Why? In order that in everything God may be glorified in Jesus Christ. To him belong the glory and the dominion forever and ever. Amen. What is the chief end of man? To glorify God and enjoy him forever. How do we glorify God and enjoy him forever in light of the end? By doing these very things that Peter tells us to do. And I think that that's how we respond rightly to any text that deals with the proclamations of the end times. We have to live rightly in light of the end. Let's close in a word of prayer.